Billionaire falls in love with a cleaning lady. What his family does will break your heart. The estate was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Clara adjusted her gloves and tugged the cleaning cart closer to the grand hallway lined with marble floors and gold-framed paintings. She was used to working in places like this, surrounded by luxury that felt worlds apart from her own life. The grand estate belonged to the Morrison family, old money, influential, and insular. Clara was just another pair of hands to keep their perfect image intact. She moved methodically, her mind drifting to her son, Alex. He'd been coughing last night, and Clara worried she'd need to find time to take him to the clinic. Money was tight as it was. She couldn't afford to miss work, but Alex came first. Always. The thought of him smiling despite his cold brought a faint curve to her lips. A loud voice echoed down the hallway, pulling her back to reality. Clara froze, instinctively shrinking against the wall as heavy footsteps approached. It was Mr. Morrison, the patriarch, his deep baritone carrying a sharp edge. "This family is not a democracy," he said, his voice laced with authority. "We have a legacy to protect. Daniel will do what's expected of him." Another voice chimed in, this one softer, but no less cutting. "Mrs. Morrison. He's too sentimental. That girl he's been spending time with, the artist, she's a distraction. We'll arrange the marriage as planned." Clara felt a pang of guilt for overhearing, but their voices carried, leaving her no choice but to absorb the conversation. She wasn't sure who they were talking about, but it was clear they were making decisions for someone who didn't have much say in the matter. As the voices faded, Clara exhaled and pushed her cart forward. Her foot caught on the edge of a rug, and the sound of a small bottle of polish clattering to the floor echoed louder than she expected. Panic flooded her as she quickly bent to pick it up. "Who's there?" Mrs. Morrison's sharp tone snapped through the air. Clara stood, hands trembling slightly, her cleaning supplies clutched tightly. "It's just me, ma'am. I was cleaning the floors." Mrs. Morrison's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the marble surface. "Be careful where you eavesdrop. Some things are not for staff to hear." "I wasn't," Clara started, but the older woman cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Just do your job and keep your head down." Clara nodded quickly, biting back a retort. She needed this job too much to risk anything. Mrs. Morrison's icy glare lingered for a moment before she turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply as she walked away. As Clara resumed her cleaning, her heart still racing, she couldn't shake the heaviness of what she'd overheard. It wasn't her business, but the disdain in Mrs. Morrison's voice made her stomach twist. This family might have all the wealth in the world, but they seemed as far from warmth and kindness as anyone Clara had ever known. Hours later, as the house began to settle into its evening calm, Clara was finishing up in the main study when a voice startled her. "Long day." She turned quickly, finding herself face to face with Daniel Morrison. He was standing in the doorway, his jacket slung over one shoulder, his tie loosened. There was a weariness in his expression that made him seem more approachable than she expected. "Oh, Mr. Morrison," she said, hastily putting down her cleaning rag. "I didn't see you there. I was just finishing." "Don't rush on my account," he said, stepping into the room. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Clara hesitated. She wasn't used to the Morrison family speaking to her directly, let alone with such casual politeness. "It's fine, sir. I'm nearly done." "Daniel," he corrected with a faint smile. "You don't have to call me, sir." Clara didn't know how to respond to that, so she nodded and returned to wiping down the desk. Daniel walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling estate grounds. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" he asked, more to himself than her. "But sometimes it feels empty." Clara glanced at him, surprised by his candor. "I guess it depends on how you look at it." He turned to her, curiosity in his eyes. "And how do you see it?" "I think," Clara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think a place like this can be beautiful, but it doesn't mean much if it doesn't feel like home." Daniel's expression shifted, a flicker of something vulnerable crossing his face. "That's a good way to put it." An awkward silence followed, but before Clara could excuse herself, Daniel spoke again. "I've seen you around. You've been working here long." "About 6 months," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "You like it?" Clara almost laughed but caught herself. "It's work. I'm grateful to have it." Daniel nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "That's fair." She felt his eyes linger on her for a moment longer, But when she looked up, he had turned back toward the window. Clara finished cleaning and quietly left the room, her thoughts swirling. As Clara left the study, her footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors. She felt a strange tension in her chest. Daniel Morrison wasn't what she expected. There was something about him, his quiet tone, his thoughtful gaze, that felt out of place in the cold, commanding aura of the Morrison estate. By the time she returned to her small apartment, the day's events weighed heavily on her. Alex, her 7-year-old son, was sprawled out on the couch, his tiny body rising and falling steadily with each breath. Clara smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his face. He'd fallen asleep waiting for her again. After a quick dinner of reheated soup, Clara settled in at the small kitchen table, pulling out the envelope of bills that she carefully managed each month. She sighed as she shuffled through them, the numbers always looming larger than her paycheck. Alex needed a new jacket, and the landlord had mentioned an increase in rent. She rubbed her temples, the stress pressing down on her like a physical weight. Her thoughts drifted back to Daniel. She wondered how someone who lived in unimaginable luxury could feel the kind of emptiness he described. It wasn't her place to judge, but it was hard to reconcile his quiet vulnerability with the image of the family she worked for. They had everything, didn't they? Yet they seemed more hollow than happy. The next day, Clara returned to the estate early, as always. She was in the library, dusting the towering shelves, when Daniel appeared again. He leaned casually against the doorframe, watching her work for a moment before speaking. "Morning." She turned, startled but trying not to show it. "Good morning, Mr. Daniel." His smile was faint but genuine. "You always start this early?" "Someone has to," she replied with a small shrug. "These shelves don't clean themselves." He chuckled softly, stepping further into the room. "It's impressive the work you do here. I don't think anyone really stops to appreciate it." Clara didn't know how to respond. It was rare for anyone in the house to acknowledge her at all, let alone offer something resembling a compliment. "Thank you," she said after a moment, her voice cautious. Daniel ran his fingers along the edge of a desk, his expression distant. "Do you ever feel like you're invisible? Like no one really sees you?" Clara froze, unsure where he was going with the question. "I think sometimes," she admitted. "But that's part of the job, isn't it? We're here to make things work smoothly, not to be noticed." "That doesn't mean it's fair," he said, his voice softer now. "You shouldn't have to feel invisible." Clara studied him, her curiosity growing. Why was he telling her this? What did it matter to someone like him, who had the attention of the world whenever he wanted it? "It's just the way things are," she said, turning back to her work. He didn't reply immediately, but she could feel his gaze lingering. "Maybe it doesn't have to be," he said finally, almost to himself. The weight of his words hung in the air, but Clara forced herself to stay focused. This was dangerous territory, and she couldn't afford to blur the lines between her role and his. No matter how kind or approachable he seemed, he was still her employer. The days that followed brought more unexpected interactions. Daniel seemed to seek her out, appearing in places she worked with casual excuses. He asked questions about her life, her son, her dreams. At first, Clara was guarded, unsure of his intentions. But gradually, she found herself opening up, sharing small pieces of her story. One afternoon, while she polished the ornate railings of the grand staircase, Daniel approached with a curious glint in his eyes. "You mentioned your son the other day," he said. "What's his name?" "Alex," Clara said cautiously. "He's 7. Daniel nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "7's a good age." Full of curiosity. "He is," Clara replied, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "He loves to draw. He can spend hours creating these little stories with his pictures." "Sounds like a creative kid," Daniel said. "Takes after you." Clara laughed lightly. "Maybe, but he's got more imagination than I ever did." Daniel's expression softened, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw a flicker of envy in his eyes. "You're lucky," he said quietly, "to have something so real." Clara paused, her hand stilling on the railing. She didn't know what to say. Daniel's life seemed so far removed from hers, but there was an unmistakable longing in his words that struck a chord. Before she could respond, the sound of sharp heels clicking against the floor interrupted them. Mrs. Morrison appeared, her cold gaze snapping between Clara and Daniel. "Daniel," she said, her tone clipped. "We need to talk." "No." Daniel straightened, his expression hardening. "I'll be there in a minute." Mrs. Morrison's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned on her heel and disappeared down the hall. Clara quickly resumed her work, her heart racing. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. Daniel lingered for a moment before following his mother, his jaw tight. Clara resumed her work as Daniel disappeared down the hall, his mother's sharp words lingering in the air like a storm cloud. She didn't know what their conversation would entail, but she could guess. People like Mrs. Morrison didn't waste time hiding their disapproval. She tried to shake it off, focusing on her cleaning, but it was no use. Daniel's words, his quiet demeanor, and the way he seemed genuinely interested in her life stayed with her. He wasn't like the others in the house, that much was clear. But why he sought her out was something she couldn't quite figure out and wasn't sure she wanted to. Meanwhile, Daniel followed his mother into the study, shutting the heavy wooden door behind him. Mrs. Morrison stood by the window, her back straight, her arms crossed. She turned only slightly when he entered, her icy gaze meeting his. "Do you care to explain why I just witnessed?" she asked, her voice cool and measured. "There's nothing to explain," Daniel said, keeping his tone calm. "I was having a conversation." "With the help," she snapped, her composure cracking just slightly. "Do you have any idea how that looks? How inappropriate it is?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "She's a person, a mother, not just the help." Mrs. Morrison let out a sharp laugh, her disdain palpable. "You're so naive. People like her don't belong in our world, Daniel. They're here to serve a purpose, and that's it. You're embarrassing yourself." "I don't care how it looks," he said firmly. "And I'm not going to treat someone like they're beneath me just because they don't live in a mansion." Mrs. Morrison turned fully to face him now, her expression hardening. "You have responsibilities, a legacy to uphold. Everything we've built, everything this family represents is riding on you. You think you can just throw that away because of some passing interest?" Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. "This has nothing to do with the family or the business. It's my life, and I'll decide who I spend time with." His mother stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous low. "You'll do as you're told, Daniel. We've already started arrangements with the Carter family. Their daughter will make a suitable match, and you'll agree to it. This nonsense ends now." Daniel stared at her, a mix of anger and disbelief coursing through him. "You're trying to arrange my life like it's a business deal. I'm not some asset you can leverage." Mrs. Morrison's expression remained cold and unyielding. "You're my son, and you'll do what's expected of you. End of discussion." Without another word, she swept past him, leaving him standing alone in the study. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had always known his family valued appearances and tradition above all else, but this was a new low. They were willing to dictate every aspect of his life, no matter the cost. Later that evening, Clara was in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes and trying to keep her thoughts from spiraling. She had seen enough of the Morrison family's coldness to know that whatever Daniel faced with his mother, it wasn't easy. But it wasn't her place to get involved. She was just an employee after all. Still, when Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression weary but determined, she couldn't ignore the pang of concern that shot through her. "Rough day?" she asked cautiously. He managed a small smile. "You could say that." Clara hesitated before speaking again. "I hope I didn't cause any trouble earlier." Daniel shook his head. "It's not you. It's them. They don't like anything or anyone that doesn't fit into their perfect little world." Clara wiped her hands on a towel, unsure how to respond. Sometimes you just have to let people think what they want. It's easier that way. "Maybe," Daniel said, stepping further into the kitchen. "But I'm tired of living my life for their approval, for their expectations. I don't want to be that person anymore." Clara studied him, her curiosity growing. "Then who do you want to be?" He leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. "Someone who doesn't have to pretend. Someone who can make his own choices." There was a quiet intensity in his words that made Clara's chest tighten. She didn't know what to say, so she looked away, focusing on the dishes again. "You're lucky," Daniel continued after a moment. "You live your life on your own terms." Clara let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Lucky? I can barely make rent most months. I don't think that counts as lucky." "But it's real," Daniel said. "It's yours. That's more than I can say." Clara glanced at him, his sincerity catching her off guard. She could see it now, the loneliness he carried, the weight of a life that wasn't truly his. And for the first time, she wondered if, despite their differences, they might have more in common than she thought. Clara dried her hands on a towel, unsure of how to respond. Daniel's words had caught her off guard. It wasn't often she heard someone like him, someone who had everything she'd ever dreamed of, longing for something as simple as control over their own life. "You think I'm lucky because I don't have your family breathing down my neck," she said softly. "But I think you're lucky to have the kind of resources to even think about choosing your own path. For some of us, it's just about surviving." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. Surviving isn't enough. It's not the same as living. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't want to admit how much his words resonated. For years, she had told herself she was doing enough, keeping Alex fed, clothed, and safe. But deep down, she longed for more, for a life where she didn't have to scrape by or live in constant fear of the rug being pulled out from under her. "You say that like it's so easy," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Like we all get a choice." Daniel straightened, a flicker of determination crossing his face. "Maybe it's not easy, but that doesn't mean it's not possible." She shook her head, turning back to the sink. "I don't have the luxury of possibilities, Daniel. I have a son to think about." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling between them. Daniel seemed to hesitate before speaking again, his voice softer this time. "Maybe I don't understand what it's like to be in your shoes, but I do know what it feels like to want more. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you don't have to settle for what other people think you deserve." Clara didn't reply. She couldn't. The truth of his words was too painful, too close to the parts of herself she tried to ignore. Instead, she focused on the rhythmic motion of scrubbing a plate, hoping he wouldn't press further. After a moment, Daniel sighed. "I'm sorry if I overstepped. I didn't mean to make things harder for you." She glanced at him, surprised by the genuine regret in his tone. "It's okay," she said quietly. I can't afford to think like that." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get it. But for what it's worth, I think you're stronger than you realize." Clara felt her heart skip a beat, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. This was dangerous territory, letting herself get drawn into his world, his words. She couldn't forget who he was, or the fact that his kindness, no matter how sincere, didn't change the stark reality of their differences. "Thanks," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel lingered for a moment longer, as if searching for something else to say. But when the silence stretched, he simply gave her a small nod and left the kitchen, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. In the days that followed, Daniel's presence became harder to ignore. He seemed to appear wherever Clara was, his conversations always hovering on the edge of something deeper. Clara found herself torn. Part of her wanted to keep her distance, to protect the fragile balance of her life. But another part of her, the part that hadn't felt truly seen in years, couldn't help but be drawn to him. One evening, as she was cleaning the grand dining room, Daniel walked in, carrying a tray with 2 mugs of coffee. Clara raised an eyebrow as he set the tray on the polished table. "You look like you could use a break," he said, sliding a mug toward her. Clara hesitated. "I don't think this is allowed." He smirked. "Consider it a rebellion." She let out a reluctant laugh, taking the mug but staying on her feet. "Thanks. But if your mother sees this, I'm not sure who she'll fire first, you or me." "She's not here," Daniel said simply, taking a sip of his coffee. "And even if she were, I'd take the blame." Clara stared at him, unsure whether to be touched or annoyed. "You really don't care what they think, do you?" "Not anymore," he admitted. "I spent most of my life trying to meet their expectations. It didn't make me happy. It just made me trapped." Clara frowned, swirling her coffee absently. "What changed?" He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "You." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Clara's heart raced, but she quickly shook her head. "Daniel, don't." "I'm serious," he said, his tone earnest. "You've made me see things differently. Made me realize that I don't have to keep living for them. That I want something more." Clara set her mug down, stepping back slightly. "You don't even know me." "Not really. You've been kind, and I appreciate that, but this, whatever this is, it's not real." "It feels real to me," Daniel said softly. Her chest tightened, a part of her wanting to believe him, to let herself feel the same. But the walls she had built around herself were strong, and she wasn't ready to let them crumble. "It doesn't matter how it feels," she said, her voice firm. "Your family won't allow it. And I have Alex to think about. I can't risk losing everything just because you feel, whatever this is." Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, but he stopped himself, his expression shifting to one of quiet determination. "I get it. You're scared. But I'm not going to give up, Clara. Not on you. Not on this." She stared at him, torn between frustration and a flicker of hope she couldn't quite extinguish. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said finally. "Maybe," he said with a faint smile. "But some things are worth it." Clara couldn't sleep that night. Daniel's words echoed in her mind, stirring emotions she had tried so hard to bury. Some things are worth it. She kept telling herself it was foolish. Getting involved with someone like him, even entertaining the possibility, was reckless. But there was a part of her, a small voice buried beneath years of survival mode, that wanted to believe him. The next day at the estate, Clara tried to keep her head down, focusing on her tasks and avoiding any chance encounters with Daniel. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. She was in the garden, trimming the overgrown hedges, when his voice broke through the quiet. "Trying to avoid me?" Clara startled, her hands tightening on the shears. She turned to find Daniel leaning against a nearby bench, his casual posture a stark contrast to the tension she felt. "I'm working," she said, her tone clipped. "Looks like hard work," he said, nodding toward the hedge. "Mind if I help?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "Do you even know how to use these?" she asked, holding up the shears. Daniel grinned. "How hard can it be?" Against her better judgment, she handed him a tool, watching as he clumsily attempted to cut the hedge. His movements were awkward, and the shears slipped from his grip twice before she finally stepped in. "Okay, stop," she said, taking the shears back. "You're going to ruin the hedge." "I was trying to help," he said with mock indignation. "You're better at watching," Clara replied, unable to hide her smirk. Daniel chuckled, his gaze lingering on her a moment too long. "You're smiling. I'll take that as a win." Clara rolled her eyes but couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her chest. She returned to trimming the hedge, acutely aware of Daniel's presence beside her. "So, I've been thinking," he said after a moment. "Dangerous," she quipped without looking at him. He laughed, shaking his head. "I'm serious. I want to take you and Alex somewhere." That made her stop. She turned to him, her expression incredulous. "What?" "I mean it," Daniel said. "There's a fair in town this weekend. I thought it might be fun." Clara's first instinct was to shut him down, to remind him of how impossible this idea was. But the thought of Alex at a fair, his eyes lighting up at the sights and sounds, made her hesitate. "Daniel, I can't just." "It's just a day," he interrupted gently. "You both deserve to have a little fun." Clara stared at him, torn. Part of her wanted to say yes, to let herself believe for just one moment that this could work. But reality was a persistent weight on her shoulders. "What about your family?" she asked. "They'd never approve of you spending time with someone like me." "They don't get to decide how I spend my time," Daniel said firmly. "Not anymore." Clara looked away, her mind racing. She wanted to trust him, to believe that he could shield her from the storm that would inevitably follow. But years of struggle had taught her to be cautious, to protect herself and Alex at all costs. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Daniel smiled, sensing her resolve softening. "That's all I ask." Despite her reservations, Clara found herself agreeing to the outing. That Saturday, she dressed Alex in his best clothes and tried to ignore the nervous flutter in her stomach as they waited outside their apartment. When Daniel's car pulled up, Alex's eyes widened in awe. "Is that his car?" Alex whispered, tugging at her sleeve. Clara nodded, her smile tight. "It's just a car, Alex." Daniel stepped out, his smile warm as he approached them. "You must be Alex," he said, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. Alex nodded shyly, hiding slightly behind Clara. "Hi." Daniel grinned. "I hear you're a pretty good artist." Alex peeked out, curiosity winning over his nerves. "I like to draw." "Well, maybe you can show me your drawings sometime," Daniel said. "But first, how about we go have some fun?" Alex's face lit up, and Clara felt her chest tighten. She forced herself to stay grounded, to remind herself that this was just one day. Nothing more. At the fair, Alex's laughter was contagious. He darted from one game to the next, his excitement bubbling over as Daniel indulged his every whim. Clara watched from the sidelines, her usual wariness slipping away in the face of Alex's joy. "You're pretty good with kids," she said as Daniel handed Alex a massive stuffed bear he'd won at a ring toss game. Daniel shrugged, his smile easy. "I like making him happy." "I like making you happy." Clara's breath hitched, but before she could respond, Alex tugged at her hand, begging her to join him on a nearby carousel. She let him pull her along, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the fair. The day was perfect. Too perfect. As they returned to the apartment, Clara felt the weight of reality creeping back in. She knew this couldn't last, that Daniel's family wouldn't stand for it. But for one fleeting moment, she let herself hope. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly as they stood outside her door. "I wanted to," Daniel replied. "You and Alex deserve more than what life's given you." Clara hesitated, her walls threatening to crumble. "Daniel, this isn't. Just let it be what it is," he said, his voice gentle. "No pressure. No expectations. Just us." She wanted to believe him. She really did. But as she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the reality of their differences loomed large. As Clara closed the door behind her, she leaned against it, her heart racing. Alex was chattering excitedly about the fair, clutching the oversized bear Daniel had won for him. His joy filled the small apartment, momentarily pushing away Clara's doubts and fears. But as she tucked him into bed later that night, her mind began to churn. Daniel had been kind, genuine even, but his world was nothing like hers. The Morrison family wouldn't allow someone like her to step into their orbit without consequences. And yet, she couldn't deny the way he looked at her or the way he treated Alex as if he mattered just as much as anyone else in his life. Clara sat at the kitchen table long after Alex fell asleep, staring at the mug of tea in her hands. She told herself it was impossible, foolish even, but a small part of her clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, Daniel could be the exception to all her fears. The next day at the estate, Clara's attempts to avoid Daniel were futile. He seemed to have a sixth sense for finding her, his presence as steady as the ticking of the grand clock in the foyer. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, finding her in the library as she dusted the high shelves. "Regret what?" she replied, not looking at him. "Yesterday, going to the fair." Clara paused, her hands tightening on the duster. "No," she admitted after a moment. "Alex had a wonderful time. That's what matters." Daniel stepped closer, his voice soft. "It mattered to me, too." Clara turned to face him, her resolve wavering under the weight of his gaze. "Daniel, this can't work. You know that, right? Your family. They don't control me," he interrupted, his tone firm. "They've tried for years, but I'm done letting them dictate my life." "They'll never accept me," Clara said, her voice breaking slightly. "And I can't put Alex through that." "They don't have to accept you," Daniel said, his expression fierce. "I do. And I don't care what they think." Clara's chest tightened, her emotions a storm she couldn't contain. "It's not that simple," she whispered. "Maybe it's not," Daniel replied. "But nothing worth having ever is." Later that evening, as Clara worked in the dining room, Mrs. Morrison entered, her presence as cold and commanding as ever. Clara straightened instinctively, her heart sinking. "I've noticed you've been distracted lately," Mrs. Morrison said, her tone sharp. "That's unacceptable." "I'm sorry, ma'am," Clara said quickly, keeping her gaze low. Mrs. Morrison's lips thinned. "I don't tolerate insubordination, and I certainly don't tolerate staff who overstep their boundaries." Clara froze, her stomach twisting. "I don't understand." "Don't play coy," Mrs. Morrison snapped. "Whatever is happening between you and my son ends now. Do you hear me? You're not one of us, and you never will be." Clara's breath caught, her worst fears coming true. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling. Mrs. Morrison stepped closer, her cold eyes locking onto Clara's. "Wrong or not, you've made yourself a problem. And I don't tolerate problems." Clara nodded quickly, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'll stay out of his way." "You'll do more than that," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice like ice. "You'll leave." Clara blinked, her heart dropping. "Leave. Pack your things and go," Mrs. Morrison said. "Consider this your last day." Clara wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the weight of Mrs. Morrison's authority crushed her resolve. She needed this job, but not at the cost of her dignity or Alex's security. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. When Daniel found out later that evening, he was furious. He stormed into the drawing room where his parents sat, his eyes blazing. "You fired her," he demanded, his voice echoing off the walls. Mrs. Morrison barely looked up from her book. She was overstepping. It was for the best. For who? Daniel shot back. "Certainly not for me." His father sighed, setting down his newspaper. "Daniel, this isn't about you. It's about the family. You have responsibilities." "To what?" "To maintain some illusion of perfection." Daniel interrupted. "Clara is the most genuine person I've ever met, and you couldn't stand it." Mrs. Morrison's gaze hardened. "She doesn't belong in this world, Daniel. And the sooner you realize that, the better." Daniel shook his head, disgusted. "You don't get to decide who matters to me. Not anymore." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked out, his mind set on finding Clara and fixing the damage his family had done. When Daniel arrived at Clara's apartment later that night, she was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn. Alex was asleep in his room, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. "Daniel," she said, standing as he entered. "You shouldn't be here." "I had to see you," he said, his voice desperate. "What they did, what my mother did, it's not fair." Clara folded her arms, her exhaustion evident. "It doesn't matter. They were right. I don't belong in your world." "Yes, you do," Daniel said fiercely. "You belong with me." Clara shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not that simple. I can't risk Alex's future. He's all I have. And you're all I have," Daniel said, stepping closer. "Please don't let them win." Clara looked at him, her heart breaking. "You don't understand. This isn't just about us. It's about everything else." "Then let me fight for it," Daniel pleaded. "For you. For Alex. For us." For a long moment, Clara said nothing, her emotions warring with her fears. Finally, she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Okay." Daniel exhaled in relief, pulling her into his arms. "We'll make this work. I promise." The days that followed were a blur of tension and determination. Daniel's decision to defy his family was met with immediate backlash. His mother, livid that he had gone after Clara despite her ultimatum, began pulling every string at her disposal to undermine him. His father remained silent, but the disapproval in his eyes was unmistakable. To them, Daniel's actions weren't just a rebellion, they were a betrayal of everything the Morrison name stood for. But Daniel didn't care. He spent every free moment with Clara and Alex, doing everything he could to reassure her that they would face whatever came their way together. Clara, though hesitant at first, began to trust his resolve. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope for something better, not just for her, but for Alex too. One evening, Daniel invited Clara and Alex to dinner at a small, family-owned restaurant he frequented. It was a far cry from the lavish parties and high-end establishments his family typically patronized, but that was precisely why he loved it. The warm atmosphere, the simple food, and the friendly faces reminded him of what life could be without the weight of expectations. Clara was nervous as they entered, her hand resting protectively on Alex's shoulder. But Daniel greeted the staff with an ease that quickly put her at ease. "Hey, Daniel," the owner, a cheerful woman in her 50s, called out. "Long time no see." "Good to see you, Maria," Daniel said with a smile. "I brought some special guests tonight." Maria's eyes lit up as she glanced at Clara and Alex. "Well, it's about time you brought someone special around here. Come on, let me get you the best table." As they settled in, Clara couldn't help but notice how relaxed Daniel seemed. This was a side of him she hadn't seen before, a side that felt real and grounded, far removed from the grandeur of the Morrison estate. "This place is amazing," she said, glancing around at the cozy decor. Daniel smiled. "I thought you might like it." No pressure, no judgment. Just good food and good company. Alex, who had been quiet up until now, perked up as a plate of warm bread was placed on the table. "Can I try it, Mom?" he asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Clara nodded, her heart swelling at the sight of her son's happiness. "Go ahead, sweetheart." As they ate, Daniel told stories about his childhood, about sneaking away from his tutors to visit places like this, and how he used to dream of a life beyond his family's expectations. Clara listened intently, her walls slowly crumbling as she realized how much they had in common. Despite their vastly different circumstances, they both knew what it felt like to want more than the hand life had dealt them. But the peace was short-lived. Word of Daniel's relationship with Clara soon reached the Morrison family's inner circle, and the backlash was swift. The family's lawyers began probing into Clara's past, looking for anything they could use to discredit her. Rumors spread through social circles, whispers about Daniel's scandalous choice tarnishing the family name. One afternoon, as Clara walked home from the market, a black car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing Mrs. Morrison's icy gaze. "Get in," she said sharply. Clara hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to walk away. But the fear of what might happen if she refused forced her to comply. She climbed into the car, her heart pounding. Mrs. Morrison didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You've caused enough damage," she said coldly. "Whatever you think this is with my son, it ends now." Clara clenched her fists, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Mrs. Morrison laughed bitterly. "You think this is about right or wrong? This is about power, reputation, and legacy. Things you'll never understand." Clara met her gaze, her own resolve hardening. "I understand more than you think. I understand that Daniel deserves to make his own choices, and I won't let you take that from him." Mrs. Morrison's eyes narrowed, her tone venomous. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Garcia. If you care about your son, you'll do the right thing and leave." The car stopped abruptly, and the driver opened the door. Clara stepped out, her hands trembling, but her head held high. She didn't say another word as the car sped away, but her mind raced with fear and determination. When Daniel found out what had happened, he was furious. He stormed into his parents' study, his voice shaking with anger. "How dare you threaten her?" he demanded. Mrs. Morrison didn't even flinch. "I'm protecting this family. You're destroying it," Daniel shot back. "You don't care about me or what I want. All you care about is your image." His father finally spoke, his tone weary. "You don't understand the consequences of your actions, Daniel. This isn't just about you." "No," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "It's always about you. About the family. About control." "Well, I'm done. You can keep your wealth, your power, your name. I don't want any of it." Mrs. Morrison's expression darkened. "Don't be foolish, Daniel. You can't walk away from this." "Watch me," he said, his voice firm. "I choose Clara. I choose Alex. And there's nothing you can do to change that." Daniel's declaration reverberated through the Morrison estate like a thunderclap. His mother's icy composure faltered for a split second before returning, colder and sharper than ever. His father stood silent, his expression unreadable, but Daniel didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked out of the study, his resolve unshaken. That night, Daniel arrived at Clara's apartment. The weight of the confrontation with his family was heavy on his shoulders, but it lifted the moment he saw her. Clara opened the door cautiously, her tired eyes widening as she took in his determined expression. "What happened?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. "I told him," he said simply. "I told him I'm done. I told him I choose you." Clara froze, her heart pounding. "Daniel, you can't just—" "I can't," he interrupted, stepping closer. "And I did." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "You don't understand what you've done. They'll make your life impossible. They'll destroy everything you've worked for." Daniel took her hands, his grip firm but gentle. "None of that matters to me anymore. I don't want their version of success. I want a life that's real. A life with you and Alex." Clara's walls crumbled as tears spilled down her cheeks. For so long, she had convinced herself that this was impossible. That love, real love, wasn't meant for someone like her. But Daniel's sincerity, his unwavering resolve, broke through every doubt and fear she had clung to. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to let myself believe in this." Daniel cupped her face, his eyes locking onto hers. "Then let me show you. Let me prove to you that we can have this. That we deserve this." For the first time, Clara let herself hope. She nodded, her tears turning to laughter as Daniel pulled her into his arms. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. Daniel severed ties with his family, selling his shares in the family business and using the funds to start fresh. It wasn't easy. Mrs. Morrison made good on her threats to ruin his reputation, spreading rumors that painted him as reckless and ungrateful. But Daniel remained steadfast, refusing to let their manipulations control his life any longer. He used part of his newfound freedom to help Clara and Alex. He enrolled Alex in a better school, one where his artistic talents could flourish. He encouraged Clara to pursue her own dreams, helping her secure a small space to open her own cleaning and organizational business. Their relationship deepened in ways neither of them had expected. For Daniel, being with Clara and Alex felt like coming home for the first time. For Clara, Daniel's unwavering support and love showed her a life she never thought possible. Months later, on a warm spring evening, Daniel took Clara and Alex to a park just outside the city. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the grass as Alex ran ahead, chasing fireflies. Clara watched him with a smile, her hands slipping into Daniel's as they walked. "You know," Daniel said, his voice soft, "I never thought I'd feel this way." "What way?" Clara asked, glancing up at him. "Like I've finally found where I belong," he said, his eyes full of warmth. Clara's smile widened, but faltered slightly as Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her fully. She noticed the nervous energy in his posture, the way he shifted his weight before dropping to one knee. "Daniel," she breathed, her hands flying to her mouth. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "Clara," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You and Alex have given me something I never thought I'd have, a real family. You've shown me what it means to love and be loved, and I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Clara's heart felt like it might burst. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, her voice breaking as she said, "Yes. Yes, of course." Alex ran back just in time to see Daniel sliding the ring onto Clara's finger. "What's happening?" he asked, his wide eyes darting between them. Clara laughed through her tears, scooping him into her arms. "We're going to be a family," she said, her voice full of joy. Daniel wrapped his arms around them both, holding them tightly as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time, everything felt right. The wedding was small, but filled with love. It was held in the same park where Daniel had proposed, surrounded by the people who had stood by them through everything. Clara wore a simple dress, her hair adorned with wildflowers, while Alex walked her down the aisle, grinning from ear to ear. Daniel's vows were heartfelt, a testament to the journey that had brought them together. Clara's voice trembled as she spoke her own, promising to build a life with him rooted in love, trust, and the strength they had found in each other. As they exchanged rings and kissed, the crowd erupted in cheers. Alex ran up to them, wrapping his arms around their legs, and the three of them stood together, a symbol of the family they had fought to create. In the months that followed, Daniel and Clara built a life that was uniquely their own. Daniel's new business ventures flourished, rooted in values of integrity and compassion. Clara's cleaning business expanded, and Alex continued to thrive, his drawings now hanging proudly in their cozy home. They didn't have the Morrison wealth or the grand estate, but they had something far more valuable, a life filled with love, laughter, and the freedom to be themselves. As they sat together on the porch one evening, watching Alex play in the yard, Clara turned to Daniel, her hand resting on his. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "Miss what?" he replied, his eyes on her. "The life you had before." Daniel smiled, shaking his head. "Not for a second," he said. "This is everything I've ever wanted." Clara leaned into him, her heart full. For the first time in her life, she felt whole. And as the sun set over their little corner of the world, she knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together. They had chosen each other, and that was all that mattered.